The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Fifth Avenue, painting the busy New York street in streaks of gold and gray. Sophie Morales, only 7 years old, sat on the cold asphalt with her back straight and her small hands gripping the white cane that had guided her since she could remember. Beside her, Shadow, a trained K9 with deep brown eyes and a sleek black coat, lay still, his breathing heavy but steady. Around them, the chaos of sirens and shouting had suddenly quieted, replaced by the uneasy hum of engines idling. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, sensing that whatever had just happened was more than a routine police call. Detective Michael Donnelly stood a few feet away, his weathered face caught between professional duty and a creeping sense of guilt. He had been on the force for over 2 decades, seen every kind of street scene imaginable, but nothing about this felt right. Sophie's tear-streaked cheeks reflected both fear and confusion, her lips trembling as she tried to understand the harsh voices and hurried footsteps around her. Shadow's protective body pressed against her leg, his gaze locked on Donnelly as if demanding answers. Captain Salvatore DeLuca approached from behind the police line, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd of officers. His voice was low but firm. "What's the situation?" Donnelly hesitated. This wasn't just about protocol anymore, it was about optics, consequences, and the sudden awareness that they might have made a mistake. The little girl's blind eyes stared in his direction, unseeing yet somehow piercing. Reporters had already started gathering, their cameras snapping, microphones extended like weapons, ready to capture a headline. Carol Stein from Channel 8 News moved closer, sensing a story that could set the city buzzing. "Detective, is the child in danger?" she asked, her tone walking the line between concern and provocation. Donnelly ignored her, focusing instead on the way Sophie's small fingers clung to Shadow's harness, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. In the background, paramedic Eddie Vasquez knelt beside the K9, checking for injuries. "He's winded, maybe took a hit, but he's alive," he reported softly. Sophie tilted her head, listening to the voices, trying to piece together what she could not see. Somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred. A voice from long ago warning her that not everyone in uniform could be trusted. Then, without warning, Sophie spoke, her voice trembling yet clear enough to cut through the murmurs. "Shadow didn't hurt anyone. You're looking for the wrong person." The street seemed to freeze at her words. Donnelly's jaw tightened, and DeLuca's eyes narrowed. Somewhere in that tense silence, everyone realized this was only the beginning. The police cordon held back a restless wall of onlookers. Some muttered about police overreach, others whispered that the girl must have done something to attract such a response. A woman in a red coat, Patricia Malone, a neighbor who had known Sophie since she was a toddler, pushed her way forward, shouting above the noise. "She's a child. She can't even see. For God's sake." Her voice carried raw outrage, but it barely dented the tense atmosphere hanging over the street. Detective Donnelly shifted his weight, feeling the press of decades of service against his conscience. He knew the official report would say the officers were responding to a possible threat, but staring at Sophie, with her delicate grip on Shadow's harness, he couldn't shake the sinking realization that this was spiraling into something far uglier than procedure. DeLuca's orders were curt and controlled. Keep everyone in place, keep questions unanswered, but Donnelly's gut twisted. Shadow, sensing his girl's distress, rose to his feet with a quiet growl. His ears pricked forward, body stiff, ready to defend. The dog's movement caused an officer at the perimeter, Jimmy Sullivan, to tense and rest his hand on his sidearm. Sophie, though blind, felt the change immediately. "Shadow, no," she whispered, her voice trembling yet steady enough to reach the nearest officers. The quiet authority in her tone made Donnelly's jaw clench. From the edge of the scene, reporter Carol Stein raised her microphone again. "Detective Donnelly, is this a wrongful detainment? Has the department made an error?" Her words sliced into the already fragile control of the situation. Cameras rolled, catching the subtle flinch in Donnelly's expression. He didn't answer, but Sophie's head turned slightly toward the sound of the reporter's voice, as if memorizing it for later. Eddie Vasquez stood, brushing dust from his knees. "She's in shock," he said quietly to Donnelly. "Whatever this is about, you need to be careful. That dog's the only anchor she's got right now." Donnelly's gaze flickered to the crowd, then back to Sophie. Her small fingers stroked Shadow's fur in slow, deliberate motions, grounding herself in the one thing she trusted. In her mind, fragments of that old warning returned, sharper now, like pieces of glass in her memory. Then, over the low hum of engines and murmurs, a deep voice emerged from the crowd. "I know that girl," it called out. Heads turned toward the speaker, an older man in a worn NYPD jacket, standing just beyond the police tape. His eyes locked on Sophie with a look that was neither casual nor kind. The air shifted instantly, and for Donnelly, the tension snapped from procedural to personal. The older man stepped forward, his NYPD jacket faded and frayed at the cuffs. His hair was silver, his jaw sharp, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and done even more. "Sophie Morales," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "I thought I'd never see you again." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, cameras zooming in on his weathered face. Sophie tilted her head toward the voice, her grip on Shadow tightening until her knuckles went white. Detective Donnelly moved to intercept him. "Sir, you need to step back." But the man didn't move. His gaze didn't waver from Sophie, and the tension in his jaw told Donnelly this wasn't just curiosity. "She's not safe here," the man said, his tone low but carrying enough for the front row of the crowd to hear. "And neither are you, detective." That last part made Donnelly's stomach tighten. He didn't know this man, but the way he spoke, like someone who understood the rules from the inside, was unsettling. Captain DeLuca approached, his eyes narrowing. "Frank Russo," he said, recognizing him instantly. "You've got no business here." The name hung in the air like a dropped weight. Russo, retired K-9 handler, once celebrated for saving a hostage during a high-profile standoff, later disgraced for reasons the department had quietly buried. And now here he was at the scene, claiming to know a blind 7-year-old girl. Sophie's breathing quickened, and though she couldn't see him, her mind tried to pull the pieces together. The surname Russo echoed in her head like a bell, but she couldn't place it. She had always been told her father was gone before she was born. No photographs, no stories, just absence. Now, in the space of a few heartbeats, a stranger with her last name was standing within arm's reach, and everyone was watching. Shadow stepped forward, putting himself between Sophie and the man, his tail low but steady, a silent barrier of loyalty. The crowd's murmurs turned to a hush, sensing something important was unfolding. Carol Stein's voice cut through again. "Mr. Russo, what's your connection to this child?" The question landed like a spark in a dry forest. Cameras tilted, microphones lifted, the city ready to devour the next revelation. Russo's eyes never left Sophie as he spoke, his voice quiet but deliberate. "She's my daughter." Gasps broke from the crowd. Officers glanced at one another, and even DeLuca's composed expression cracked for a second. Sophie froze, her hand tightening on Shadow's fur. And in that charged silence, a single tear slid down her cheek. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous: hope. The crowd's reaction swelled like a wave. Whispers, camera shutters, the scrape of shoes against pavement as people leaned forward for a better look. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came. She gripped Shadow's harness tighter, the leather warm under her palm, grounding her in a reality that suddenly felt unstable. Detective Donnelly stepped between her and Russo, but the man didn't flinch. His voice, though calm, cut through the air like a blade. "You've kept her from me for 7 years. That ends now." Captain DeLuca's jaw tightened. "You forfeited your right to speak about family the day you walked out, Russo." The older man's eyes narrowed. "Is that the story you've been feeding them? That I walked away?" His tone carried a dangerous edge, and Donnelly could sense the tension rising to a breaking point. The crowd might have been clueless about the specifics, but they could smell the conflict, and the media was already devouring it. Sophie tilted her head toward the sound of Russo's voice, her brows drawing together. "You're lying," she said softly, almost to herself, but everyone heard it. Her mother had never spoken of him except to say he was gone for good. Gone. Not hiding, not fighting to get her back. Just gone. Yet something about the way he spoke, the urgency beneath his words, unsettled her in ways she didn't understand. Shadow shifted, pressing his body against Sophie's side, his head low, watching every move. Donnelly bent slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Do you want me to get you out of here?" But before she could answer, Russo took a step forward, his voice dropping into something more desperate than defiant. "Sophie, you have to believe me. They lied to you about everything. I didn't leave. I was forced out." DeLuca barked an order. "Get him out of here." 2 officers moved in, but Russo didn't resist. Instead, he locked his gaze on Sophie one last time. "Ask them why they kept the letters. Ask them why they never told you about the night in Queens." The words hit like static in the humid air. Disconnected, strange, but heavy with meaning. Sophie's brow furrowed as her mind clung to the fragments. Letters. Queens. As Russo was pulled toward the police van, Carol Stein called after him. "Are you saying the department covered something up?" Russo didn't answer, but the look he gave DeLuca spoke louder than any words. Sophie's hand trembled as she reached down to Shadow, her voice almost a whisper. "There are things they're not telling me, aren't there?" Donnelly didn't reply, but his silence was an answer all its own. The station walls seemed to close in on Sophie. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, cold and relentless, as she sat on a hard plastic chair in a small interview room. Shadow rested at her feet, his head against her leg, sensing her unease. Detective Donnelly leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching her with a conflicted expression. He had been in this room countless times, but never with a child who looked so fragile, and yet so unyielding. Across from her, Captain DeLuca shuffled papers without looking up. "Your mother will be here soon," he said, his tone clipped, as if each word had been weighed. Sophie's voice was soft, but it didn't waver. What did he mean? About the letters? The question seemed to hang in the air, pulling the tension taut. DeLuca glanced at Donnelly, but said nothing. When silence became unbearable, Donnelly finally spoke. "Sophie, there were letters. They were never given to you. I can't tell you why." He stopped, catching the sharp glare DeLuca shot him. But Sophie had already latched onto his words like a lifeline. "Where are they?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Her voice carried a steadiness that made Donnelly uneasy. It wasn't the voice of a frightened child, but of someone demanding truth. DeLuca cleared his throat. "Those letters are not relevant to today's events." Sophie frowned, running her fingers over the cool metal of the table. "You're lying." The accusation, delivered so calmly, made Donnelly shift uncomfortably. Shadow's ears flicked, his muscles tightening as if mirroring Sophie's building tension. Before either man could respond, the door opened and a uniformed officer stepped in. "Sir, there's a call for Detective Donnelly, urgent. Something about Queens, from a blocked number." Donnelly's gaze snapped to Sophie, then to DeLuca. Without a word, he stepped out, leaving Sophie alone with the captain. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves knew a secret they wouldn't share. Sophie turned her head toward the sound of DeLuca's measured breathing. "Queens," she repeated slowly. "That's where he said it happened, isn't it?" DeLuca didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was low. "Some things are better left buried, Sophie." She shook her head. "Not for me." The firmness in her tone made DeLuca's jaw tighten, but before he could respond, Shadow gave a low, warning growl. Someone was standing just outside the door, listening. Detective Donnelly closed the door behind him, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and tense. "Who is this?" The line crackled, the voice on the other end grainy and urgent. "You don't know me, but I know what happened in Queens. And I know why Frank Russo was erased from your records." Donnelly's stomach tightened. Before he could ask questions, the line went dead. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the words anchoring him in place. Inside the interview room, Sophie sat with her head slightly tilted, her fingers tracing the grain of the metal table. She could hear muffled voices in the hallway, the scrape of shoes, the hum of the lights. Shadow pressed closer, his warm breath steady against her leg. "I can hear them lying," she murmured, more to herself than to DeLuca. The captain's silence was answer enough. Donnelly returned, his face pale but determined. "Sophie, I need to ask you something," he began, ignoring DeLuca's sharp glance. "Has anyone ever told you about the night of the warehouse fire in Queens, 7 years ago?" Sophie shook her head slowly. "No." "Why?" Donnelly hesitated. "Because that's the night your father disappeared, and the night 3 officers from this department died under suspicious circumstances." The air seemed to thicken. Sophie's breath caught, her fingers tightening on Shadow's harness. "What does that have to do with me?" Her voice was small but steady, the question a dagger pointed at both men in the room. Donnelly opened his mouth, but DeLuca cut in sharply. "It has nothing to do with you. Your father made his choices." Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "And the letters?" she asked again. Donnelly's gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, he looked almost defeated. "They were from him," he admitted. "All of them. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time he thought he could come back for you. They never reached you." Sophie's throat tightened, but she swallowed the surge of emotion. She wanted to scream, but instead, her voice came out in a whisper. "Where are they now?" Before Donnelly could answer, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the station. Officers shouted, radios crackled, and footsteps pounded against the tile floor. Shadow leapt to his feet, muscles taut. Through the open doorway, Sophie heard someone shouting her name. Frank Russo's voice, raw with urgency. Donnelly bolted for the door, and DeLuca swore under his breath. Sophie's heart pounded. Whatever was about to happen, it would not be quiet. The shouts grew louder, mingling with the pounding of boots against the tile floor. Sophie sat frozen, her hands gripping Shadow's harness so tightly that her knuckles ached. The dog stood like a statue, his body angled toward the noise, every muscle vibrating with alertness. Donnelly's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your fire. He's unarmed." Frank Russo burst into view, his NYPD jacket torn at the sleeve, his chest heaving. 2 officers trailed behind him, but none dared grab him outright. His eyes locked on Sophie, and in 3 long strides, he was kneeling in front of her. "I told you I'd come back," he said, his voice breaking. Sophie felt the heat of his presence, the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes. "You're not safe here." Captain DeLuca stormed into the room, fury etched into every line of his face. "Russo, you're under arrest." Frank didn't look at him. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, weathered envelope bound with a rubber band. "These are the letters," he said, placing them on the table in front of Sophie. "Every one I wrote to you, every one they hid." Sophie's fingers trembled as she touched the bundle, the paper edges rough against her skin. She could almost feel the years trapped inside those envelopes. Words meant for her, kept from her. "Why?" she whispered. Russo's voice hardened. "Because the truth about Queens is in there. And if you read them, you'll know why they've been keeping us apart." Donnelly's eyes flicked to DeLuca, whose jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. Before anyone could speak, the building's fire alarm blared. Red lights strobed across the walls, and the wail of the siren made Shadow bark sharply. Officers scrambled, half heading toward the exits, half securing the holding cells. Russo stood, placing himself between Sophie and the doorway. "We have to move now," he urged, his voice cutting through the noise. Donnelly hesitated, torn between duty and instinct. Then, in the swirl of noise and flashing lights, DeLuca stepped forward, his voice low but deadly. "If you walk out with her, Frank, you'll never make it past the bridge." Russo's eyes narrowed. "Then I guess we find another way," He reached for Sophie's hand, and for a brief second, she didn't pull away. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was the moment everything would change. The hallway outside the interview room was chaos. Officers shouted over each other. Radios barked rapid updates, and the shrill fire alarm filled every corner of the station. Russo tightened his grip on Sophie's hand, Shadow trotting close at her side. "Stay with me, no matter what you hear," he told her, guiding her through the confusion. Donnelly followed, scanning for DeLuca, knowing the captain wouldn't let them go without a fight. They slipped into a narrow side corridor lined with lockers and old filing cabinets. Russo moved with the certainty of someone who still remembered every inch of the building. "How do you know where to go?" Sophie asked, her voice low but steady despite the noise. "Because I built half the escape plans in this place," Russo replied. "They just never thought I'd use one." His tone carried a bitter edge that made Donnelly glance at him with suspicion. Shadow's nails clicked against the linoleum as they reached a door marked Maintenance. Russo shoved it open, revealing a dimly lit stairwell. They descended quickly, the sound of approaching footsteps above growing louder. "You still haven't told me about Queens," Sophie pressed. Russo's breath was heavy as he spoke. "It was a sting operation. We were supposed to stop a shipment of illegal weapons, but someone tipped them off. The warehouse went up in flames, and 3 good cops died. They blamed me because I lived." Donnelly slowed for a step, his mind racing. "And you think someone inside set you up?" Russo shot him a look over his shoulder. "I don't think, Detective, I know. And one of those letters proves it. That's why they never let her see them." Sophie's grip tightened on the envelope still clutched in her other hand. The paper felt like it was burning her skin, heavy with answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. They reached the bottom of the stairwell, where a rusted metal door led to the alley behind the station. Russo paused, listening. The sound of engines idling drifted in, too many for a random street. "They've got the exits covered," Donnelly warned. "You're not going to outrun this." Russo shook his head. "We're not going to run. We're going to disappear." Before Donnelly could ask how, Russo pushed the door open just a crack, and froze. Across the alley, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, stood Captain DeLuca, flanked by 2 officers with their weapons drawn. "You really thought it would be that easy, Frank?" DeLuca's voice carried cold certainty. Sophie's heart pounded as Shadow's growl deepened. The only way forward now was through them. The alley was silent except for the low hum of idling engines. Red and blue lights washed over the brick walls, making the shadows seem to move. Russo stepped forward, placing himself between Sophie and the officers, his hands raised slightly. "This doesn't have to end with blood," he called out. DeLuca's eyes narrowed. "That depends on you. Hand her over, and maybe you walk away." Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't let go of Shadow's harness. "I'm not going with him," she said firmly, her voice carrying through the cold air. DeLuca tilted his head. "You think you have a choice? Everything you know, your life, was built on keeping you away from that man." Russo's voice sharpened. "And everything you've done was built on a lie. Tell her, Sal. Tell her who tipped off the warehouse in Queens." A flicker of something, hesitation, maybe regret, crossed DeLuca's face before it hardened again. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "It was bigger than all of us. The people in that warehouse weren't just smugglers, they were protected." Donnelly stepped forward, his badge glinting in the light. "Protected by who?" he demanded. DeLuca's eyes locked on him. "By the same people signing your paycheck, Detective. You really want to pull on that thread?" Russo took a slow step closer, his voice dropping. "You framed me to cover their tracks, and you used her, my daughter, as leverage to keep me quiet. You thought if you erased me from her life, I'd give up." Sophie felt the words like a blow. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice breaking just enough to make DeLuca flinch. Silence was his only answer. Shadow growled, the sound deep and steady. Donnelly's hand hovered near his holster, but not out of fear, out of calculation. If you pull that trigger, Captain, you'll be cleaning up a mess you can't bury. Cameras are already here, he warned, nodding subtly toward a lens glinting in the darkness. DeLuca's gaze darted toward the street, where a news crew had begun filming. The tension snapped. DeLuca signaled to his officers, but instead of lowering their weapons, they hesitated, waiting for his next move. Russo held Sophie's hand tighter. "You're out of time, Sal," he said. DeLuca's jaw clenched. "So are you." Then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicked toward Sophie. "She's the key to all of it. She doesn't even know what she's carrying." The words sent a chill down her spine. Whatever truth was left, it was inside those letters. The letters trembled in Sophie's grasp. The rubber band slipped off, and one envelope slid free, landing lightly against her palm. Russo crouched beside her, his voice low but urgent. "Read the first one." Sophie's fingers traced the raised ink of her own name before carefully opening the flap. Inside was a single sheet, the paper worn and soft from years of handling. She began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the thundering in her chest. "Sophie, if you're holding this, it means they failed to keep us apart forever. The night in Queens wasn't an accident. The warehouse was full of evidence. Names, accounts, everything tying senior officers to an arms ring. I was there to bring it down. DeLuca was there to protect it." Gasps rippled through the alley. Cameras pushed closer. DeLuca's jaw tightened like a man caught without a plan. Donnelly stepped forward, eyes fixed on the captain. "Is it true?" DeLuca's silence was answer enough. Sophie's voice didn't waver as she continued. "They planted evidence on me. They threatened your mother. The only way to keep you safe was to disappear. But I never stopped trying to reach you." By the time she finished, her hand was trembling. Shadow pressed against her leg as if to steady her. Russo's voice softened, almost breaking. "Everything I did was to keep you alive, Sophie. I couldn't let them turn you into leverage. You were my reason for fighting." Sophie's eyes, though blind, seemed to search his face for something beyond the words. Truth, trust, maybe love. "I believe you," she said finally. The news crew surged forward, their lights flooding the alley. Donnelly pulled out his phone, speaking quickly into it, his gaze never leaving DeLuca. "I'm putting this on record, every word." Officers began to shift uneasily, some lowering their weapons. DeLuca, realizing control was slipping, stepped back. His voice was cold but resigned. "You've started something you can't stop, Russo, and it's going to take both of you down." Russo turned toward Sophie, placing the bundle of letters in her hands. "Whatever happens next, these are yours. They're the truth." Sophie held them close, the weight of years pressing against her chest. As sirens wailed in the distance, this time from approaching units, she knew life would never return to what it was. But for the first time, the darkness around her didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like possibility. Shadow leaned into her side, steady and warm, and she whispered, almost to herself, "We're not running anymore.